All right, so.
But wishes he were someday.
But not today, because he is the fabulous Ralph Reed. I have a long bio. He's the chairman and CEO of Century Strategies, a public relations firm. Ralph Reed has advised numerous Fortune 500 companies and served as the senior advisor to George W. Bush's 2000 and 2004 campaigns. You should ask him about that work. Dr. Reed has worked on 7 presidential campaigns, including serving as the chair of the Southeast region for the Bush-Cheney 04 campaign. He has advised 88 campaigns for U.S. Senate, Governor, and Congress over the past quarter century. This makes you sound ancient. The Wall Street Journal called Reed, quote, perhaps the finest political operative of his generation. He was named one of the top 10 political newsmakers in the nation by Newsweek and one of the 20 most influential leaders of his generation by Life magazine, and one of the 50 future leaders of America by Time magazine. As executive director of the Christian Coalition from 1989 to 1997, he built one of the nation's most effective grassroots organizations and played a pivotal role in the election of the first Republican Congress in 40 years. Dr. Reed earned a BA in history from the University of Georgia and received his PhD from Emory University in American history in 1991. Let's give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Caroline. Appreciate that introduction, and it's good to be. This is Obama and the issues, right? So I'm going to talk about Obama and the issues. I'll talk a little bit about. I'd like to have as much, kind of dialogue between me and you as I can. So what I'd like to do is just lay out a little bit about what the current state of play is. How Obama got into the situation that he is now, just 13 months into his presidency. Look ahead a little bit to the 2010 elections, which I think promise to be potentially one of the biggest changes in the composition of a Congress that we've seen in the modern period. And then talk a little bit about what the Republican Party's got to do to rebuild and come back. Let me start with 2008, and I should probably mention parenthetically at the outset, we were talking about this earlier when I was talking to a few had the privilege of being a member of a working group at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University with then State Senator Barack Obama in 1997 and 1998. There was a sociologist at Harvard who had written a book called Bowling Alone. Some of you may have heard of it. It was basically this idea that in earlier times in American civilization, you had all kinds of voluntary and mediating institutions that people got involved in, whether it was churches or religious organizations or charities or Boys and Girls Club, Boy and Girl Scouts, bowling leagues, little leagues, all kinds of things that Americans did together. And the thesis of this professor's work was that one of the things that is making us so much more polarized and making it so much harder for us to tackle the endemic problems that ail our society, whether they're political or civil or cultural or whatever form they take, is the fact that we're not really meeting together and talking to each other anymore the way we did in the face-to-face, oral society of a previous time, before television, before iPods, before we all just texted each other or sat in front of the television set. So the idea was, let's put together a working group that spans racial and ethnic and religious and political lines and see if we can come up with some solutions to building social capital. And George Stephanopoulos was part of that group. He had just left the Clinton White House. Congressman Ben Weber, who had just left the House. Then Indianapolis Mayor Steve Goldsmith, who later went on to serve as a senior domestic policy advisor to to George W. Bush, and I was part of it. It was a fairly small group, I'd say 15 of us, and we met once a quarter, and then we issued a report that no one read except us. Until Barack Obama ran for president, and then I started to get calls from reporters about it. But my impression of Barack Obama, and I think I certainly would try for this not to be colored by subsequent events. If you've been doing this for as long as I've been doing it, you can walk into any state legislative chamber in America, you know, state senate or state house, and you know who's going statewide within 10 years. You can tell just by looking at it, the way they carry themselves, you know, the way they interact with colleagues. You just know. You got to remember, I was an intern in the Georgia State Senate in 1979 when Julian Bond was a state senator, Roy Barnes, who ended up being governor of Georgia, Paul Coverdell, who went on to be a U.S. senator, Johnny Isakson, who went on to be a U.S. senator, and Zell Miller, who was lieutenant governor and went on to be governor. So I know what it's like to sit and look at a raw talent, you know, almost like a scout would go watch somebody in AA or single A ball, and you watch him swing the bat 3 times and you go, that guy has got game. And that was clearly Barack Obama. I mean, he was a talent, even then. Well-spoken, articulate, eloquent, brilliant, always trying to find common ground, but also, and I say this as an empirical observation, why don't you sit right here so that you can get the whole, you'll be able to absorb all the information.
She has the 5.
So, and I say this not as a criticism, I truly mean this as an empirical observation. He was also very liberal. And I thought, this was my impression at the time, my impression was, you know, I like this guy, he's really smart, he's really gifted. I mean, these are gifts, you know, this isn't something you teach. You've either got it or you don't, and he clearly had it. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel like he was always leveling with me. I felt like he was telling me what he thought I wanted to hear so that we could find common ground without really telling me what he really believed and what he wanted to do. Now, I think that's still true today, and I think that that is the conundrum that he faces in his presidency, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I have to say, I was wrong about Barack Obama, because I not only didn't think he'd ever be president, I sized him up and didn't think he'd ever be able to win statewide in Illinois. Because I thought, look, he's from the south side of Chicago, he's one of the most liberal members of the state Senate, he's far to the left, this is not going to sell, you know, in southern Illinois. Now, you could make an argument that sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. He was in a crowded U.S. Senate primary after losing to Bobby Rush when he ran for the Congress, I guess in, when, 2002, I think, is when he ran for Congress. Then he ran for the Senate, I want to say, in 2004. And, you know, he was in a crowded primary and was trailing in the polls, and then the front runner, who was a self-financing candidate, blew up in a scandal. And then Obama catapulted ahead. Then he was in a potentially very tight and competitive general election, and Jack Ryan, who was the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate in Illinois, withdrew from the race after revelations involving a divorce that were of a salacious nature, and so he got to run against Alan Keyes.